Greg, let's talk about snaffle bits. This is the most common place that people start when they're starting a horse. And if we can, let's first go through how a snaffle bit is put together.
Terminology and vocabulary. Cheek of snaffle, butt of the mouthpiece. From the butt of the mouthpiece to the center is the bar space of the mouthpiece. Then, of course, the centers. We have basically two styles of snaffle. There are thousands and thousands of variations, but the basic difference is we have a loose ring snaffle, which allows the mouthpiece to run completely around the ring, and we have a fixed mouthpiece or a D-type snaffle where the mouthpiece cannot move. Quite simply, the basic difference between one and the other is the focal point of pressure. When we start colts, it's far easier if you spread the pressure point over a larger area than, for example, with a D ring, if you pull on the direct rein, it is the opposing or the outside ring that applies facial pressure over a larger area to indicate or to pull that horse's nose in the direction that you want to go. The loose ring, as horses become broker and become lighter in the hand and more responsive, the point of pressure on your loose ring is off the corner of the mouth or the buccal flap. So quite simply, when they become light, it is off that inside line as opposed to applying pressure over the larger part of the face or the outside of it. One thing we might want to talk about here are the different styles of snaffle or broken mouthpieces. There is a Dr. Bristol that is a three-piece snaffle. Some people say the applied pressure on a Dr. Bristol is more even than a snaffle, the traditional snaffle that's broken in the center.
What do you think the true effect is of having multiple breaks?
Quite simply, I think a Dr. Bristol allows you to put more top of the tongue pressure than a normal or a traditional snaffle.
Do you see benefit to that when you're working a horse in a snaffle?
The benefit would be if a horse is less sensitive and can stand the tongue pressure, obviously it might help us to have a quicker response. If they're shallow-mouthed, meaning shallow on that lower oral cavity and lighter naturally, we're not going to want to apply pressure to the top of the tongue. The tendency for them to accept that pressure is less. As we talk about this, obviously because horses are like chains and we are looking for a relaxed response, we want salivation, we want movement of the lower jaw or the mandible that shows us that they're relaxed. Because they're like a chain, that starts with salivation, applies to the tongue, and thirdly to the pole, as we start with that progression from front to back.
Perfect. Let's look at this quickly because you have two great, really big differences here between these mouthpieces, from the material they're made of to the design of the bars themselves. Talk to us about that.
Size of diameter and the material of these mouthpieces. The larger the diameter of the material from the butt to the connection in the center, the milder or smoother it's going to feel on the horse. The smaller the diameter, the more specific the pressure point, and then if we additionally add a twist to that, we are accentuating the pressure point as it crosses the interdental space. So, rule of thumb, larger diameter, milder or less severe, smaller diameter with a deviation or a twist in that area that crosses the interdental space, the more severe the reaction is going to be.
You mentioned salivation, And that goes back to material type, right? Where does copper fit into the mix?
All right. Depending on the discipline that we're talking about, for example, with jump horses, hunters, jumpers, some of the disciplines have specific rules that the bridle bit must be made of the same material. On the cheek, in the mouthpiece, most of those are stainless because English don't like things to rust. However, when we can combine materials, we like to use what is referred to as sweet iron. And in today's day and age, we don't really have the true sweet iron as it existed back before malleable metal was created. Sweet iron came from that terminology because those mouthpieces were porous and would oxidize, so they would develop a flavor. Optimally, we have found that if we combine two unlike materials, being a soft or a mild steel, technically referred to as 1018, with copper, we can actually enhance salivation, which, why do we want salivation? We want them to relax and move the tongue. So, optimally, we're going to look for the combination between the copper and the sweet iron. There are various materials. If it's an English style bridle or a dressage bridle bit, they can be made or manufactured from Monel steel, which is a nickel alloy of stainless, straight stainless, but they cannot be made out of cold rolled material or stuff that's going to rust.
Okay. Now you talked about diameter. What about, and shape, we've talked about that a little bit. What about the weight?
Obviously, the lighter the weight, if a horse is naturally light, the lighter the density or the weight of the mouthpiece, the better the response. If a horse is colder or thicker tongued, if you augment the size and diameter of that mouthpiece by weight, and once again we'll speak in generalities, anything 5/8 of an inch in diameter or bigger in the space from the butt of the mouthpiece to the center is going to be more dense and have significant enough weight to actually accentuate the signal.
And what was that breaking point again?
Anything larger than 5/8 of an inch in diameter. Once you get over that diameter, you really have a good deal of mass. Weight is very significant. If I'm going to hit you in the mouth with a 5-pound sledge, obviously if it's 5/8 or bigger, that tendency is going to occur. If it's a smaller or thinner mouthpiece, then the weight becomes less significant.
Okay. Let's go back to shape a little bit. You'll see all of these pieces here have some curvature to them versus a straight. How does that affect the snaffle in the horse's mouth?
The natural curvature that you look at here is what we call mullened in the mouthpiece. It means it is curved. When we think of application, if that mouthpiece is curved, when we put it in a horse's mouth, as it crosses the interdental space, it allows the ring or the side of the snaffle to hang farther down the mandible. There are two reasons for this. It slows the articulation down, it slows the pressure down, and if we're educating and communicating with our horse instead of forcing a move, it allows a horse a delay in time from the time we start to move our hand till we actually apply physical pressure to that area for them to get naturally balanced and be in your hand.
So it helps them prepare.
It is a delay that allows them to properly accommodate their natural balance to us, yes.
Got it. Now, this is great to look at this piece on this mouth. Let's go back to the skulls and talk about how on this mandible how they've changed from bit pressure on the bars.
We've got 3 specific mandibles here, all 3 of them different. Obviously, the one on the right was the largest horse, and just for general information, the oldest of the bunch. The one on the left was the youngest. As we study the interdental space, this is where truth becomes truth and the fibbers can't tell. When we study the interdental space, every one of them comes with a crown on the bone. It's a natural occurrence. The more we pull, or the more that we mash down on this part of the interdental space, the flatter it becomes and the wider it becomes. If we study, once again, we have to consider disciplines. If your wear pattern on that interdental space is from mid to the premolar, and that area is flat like it is on this bigger horse, we can assume that that horse was ridden with more contact, more consistently. Horses being rid English style or with contact, the head stall adjustment is going to be snugger, and the natural balance of a bit becomes less significant simply because the tension on the head stall is going to hold it between this area and this area. We can see on this interdental space, our flat or worn place in this is right in front of the premolar. As we go down the line, we look at this second horse. The flat portion is on this right side more accentuated than it is on the left side. What that tells us in terms of truth is that our rider was probably right-handed and probably pulled on the right side harder than he did the left side. If you go back and look at the lateral space on the left side, it is flatter as it comes into the premolar, which means that the force, there was more lip pressure or buccal flap pressure on the right side than there was the left. Third model, once again we have a flattening, a severe flattening, and we remember that this is our youngest individual. From the center of the interdental space to the premolar, this one's telling us that it's been pulled on a bunch.
That apex is essentially gone.
The apex of this bone is flattened out from here midway down the interdental space. He's been pulled on or bitted up. There's been a lot of pressure applied to that. So if you look at this individual in your physical inspection and feel that, you're going to know that he's going to have the tendency to be a little heavier.
Light was not the natural response.
No.
So you talked about head stalls here, where that might be set higher to adjust for where that bit is going to be carried and controlled with more collection. What about on these other skulls where we see a different placement of the bit? How does that affect head stall and curb strap?
Where your wear pattern occurs farther down the interdental space, it just means that the head stall has been adjusted more loosely. Now, when we talk about snaffle bits, you get into the conversation of curb straps. In your performance horses, like a cow horse, a lot of the reiners use a curb strap. Quite simply, it's to prevent pulling one ring through the mouth to the other side. It actually hobbles that thing to where you can't physically do that. Little thought process here, if you're pulling on a bridle bit hard enough to pull that ring through the mouthpiece, you might be pulling a little harder than what's normally acceptable.
And just a question, does it matter where that curb strap sits with your reins? Top, bottom?
Years ago in the different associations, some associations said that the rein could not be placed below the curb strap, with the interpretation that if you did, you could obtain a certain amount of leverage on a snaffle.
Not the case.
It's impossible. You can't pull on it hard enough to get any leverage off a curb strap. So the placement of the rein becomes very, very insignificant.
So with your snaffle, you're not talking about leverage, you're not talking about port pressure. What you're talking about is pull.
Side to side pull.
Yep. And obviously pressure on your interdential space, on your bars,
Exactly.
which would in turn create give.
All right, the harder you pull, for example, this guy and this guy that are flatter on the right side than they are on the left. Right hand, that pull comes closer to the premolar and is accentuated where that mouthpiece is pulled back. We're going to see lateral on this side and more lateral on that side where it comes to the interdental space. If we study that further, and when we do our physical inspection, we're going to look for callus on the buccal flap or the corner of the mouth on this side of this individual. It will be thicker than the buccal flap on the left side. Natural thing. When we go back and talk about the common denominators, about the width from apex to apex, that deviates very, very little. We have 3 samples, and I have measured everything from 2-year-olds to 27-year-olds in breeds from Arabs to quarter horse to warm blood. The most difference I've seen in measuring those spaces is about 1/4 of an inch. And it takes a great deal of deviation in the size of the entire skull for that to occur. The more notable difference, the bigger the skull, the more distance we're going to have from the premolar to the back of the incisor. Other than that, this width remains a constant.
Let's go to self-assessment and what part that plays in choosing the snaffle, the right snaffle to work with, and when you might use a more severe snaffle, obviously with the intent to go back to the best option.
We have, obviously, different mouthpieces constructed different ways for different degrees of severity. Horses are creatures of habit. If we let them develop the habit to push on our hand at, for example, a 2-pound pressure, and we care to change that habitual status, we're going to choose a mouthpiece that localizes or is more specific on the pressure point where it crosses the interdential space and where it exits the buccal flap at the side of the mouth. Smaller diameter, more severe. When we do that with the intent to change an existing habit. Once that habit, the previous or bad habit that exists is changed, we want to go back obviously to a milder or larger diameter so that we don't continue to abrade that material or create callus.
So we're educating.
Once again, you're teaching an individual rather than dominating.
Right.
Anytime a move is forced or the term trapped comes into the vocabulary, we have taken the option for that horse to seek his natural position. What that would relate to in a reiner, for example, the pivot foot being the inside hind leg. If their natural point of balance is behind center, they're going to have to take a sideward step to maintain balance. What does that do for the correctness of the maneuver? It diminishes it greatly. So once again, depending on discipline and what we're looking for, if we allow a horse to maintain natural balance, they'll find that natural balance. If we force or pull with, my example, 200 pounds of pressure on a rein, they've got to resist that or push back with an equal poundage to maintain natural balance.
Right. It is true today that we're asking for a lot more finesse from our horses and to perform like athletes that we've never seen before. That being said, what you're saying is that we can still accomplish that without forcing it?
Absolutely. The other part of that, because of the evolution, not only in our pedigrees and our disciplines, we have created a wonderful individual. It's called a horse. They're better horses, they're smarter. Obviously, they react. They are trainable. You can educate them. You don't have to dominate them. There is an equation that goes along with any of that. The more sensitive individuals we have that are extremely sensitive and extremely smart, obviously we have to be better horsemen to accommodate those things because they are that way. If we allow them to be as good as they can be, the most important element is time. If we educate, yes, it is going to take more time to do that. It's not we can't use a gimmick and we can't force a move to get an educated response.
Right.
The wonderful thing is we have horses that are currently bred that are sensitive and smart that can be taught.
Right. You mentioned something I want to come back to. Thin can be more severe. However, if we've got anything with sharp, more abrasive edges, like let's say a sharp edge square, something along those lines, that could actually, in fact, anything could be a more severe tool if it's used that way.
Absolutely, because you are, once again, this is a rather tight twist. So your points of pressure are very close together. You're going to cover a larger area. If that twist were what we call a slow twist or a longer twist, the point of pressure where it crosses the interdental space is more specific. Your square twist, being unlike a round with a curved surface, have a very abrupt edge. We have fishbacks, which are triangular in shape, and we have square twists as well. We also have square mouthpieces with no twist in them. Depending on what we want to accentuate as far as a pressure point, we're going to select our mouthpieces accordingly.
Okay. To wrap this up, when is a time you might use a bit that isn't just a simple butt bar connection like this, but has multiple breaks or, say, a frother?
All right, back to the conversation about a horse being like a chain. We want to see relaxation in the tongue so that they salivate. We want them to salivate and want that tongue to have a certain amount of movement so that the mandible itself is relaxed where it attaches to the maxilla. In doing that, yes, we can enhance by what we put in the mouthpiece. For example, if we put rollers in the center of a Dr. Bristol, sometimes referred to as a dog bone, and once again, geographically, the names or nomenclature that are applied to these things are different. I really don't care what you call them.
It's not wrong, it's just different.
It's not wrong, it's different. Originally in the 17th century, a lot of the broken mouthpieces had what was called frothers. It was 3 little dangly pieces that hung off the center of the port. The reason they did that was to irritate or aggravate movement in that tongue. And if you apply pressure to the lower tongue or put a dangler on it, a horse is going to try to accommodate those to get them out of the road. The initial response that was looked for was movement of the tongue.
Got it. Where do other tools or implements fit into this? Cavessons or nose bands? What purpose do they have with a snaffle?
I've been baited here, and I'll admit this. Anytime you restrict muscular movement over the nasal cavity, we have to remember that we have a sinus tube that runs here and one that runs down from the back of the eye, Anytime you restrict the muscular movement over the lower or the cartilaginous part of this nose, you restrict not only breathing, but the normal passage of those sinus areas. So quite simply and optimally, the less you restrict natural muscle movement, the more relaxed the mandible is going to be.
Yeah, it sounds like a mixed message too. Let's clamp this shut, but be relaxed right here.
Exactly. Quite simply, unless it is an English discipline where a horse is going to be ridden with constant contact and it is more supportive, we don't want to restrict that structure over the front of the face or the muzzle or the your nostrils.
So again, it's another time it goes back to self-assessment. Maybe it's time to get help from a great teacher, a great mentor, a trainer, somebody who can help you adjust your program to help the horse.
Or once again, is it a pre-existing bad habit that we have to alter that habit
Right.
to get the desired result?
Right. Yep. What's your goal and what do you?
Exactly. And exactly, a lot of bridle bit selection is in knowing the discipline you're in and what you expect as a reaction or result from that. All disciplines are different, so the application of the bridle or the type of bridle bit that we're going to choose is going to vary.
What are a couple of things, a couple pieces of advice you would give to somebody going out to buy their first snaffle?
I very rarely ever do that, simply because unless you know the individual's educational or skill level, combined with the educational level or skill level of the horse that they're going to buy, always as a first purchase, go as mild as you can, try to create good habits, and if you have a problem, obviously and foremost, seek professional help to allow your guidance from that point. The whole purpose and discussion here is in trying to accommodate the physical oral cavity of the horse so that we have a nice mouth over a long period of time that retains or maintains the level of sensitivity that we're looking for. If Dobbin's running off and your hat's pushed back on your forehead and you got tears coming out of both eyes and his tongue's blue and hanging out the side of his mouth, not a good indicator. Something is wrong with your bridle bit selection or your application of that bridle.
What are some other indicators that you might go with to choose when to change bits? And this could be when we're talking about progressing out of a snaffle into the section we'll talk about next.
Anytime that you see abnormalities, and those abnormalities would be excessive salivation, which indicates that we have a certain amount of tongue damage, or we've got a cut tongue, or we've got a physical irregularity in the mucosa. There is something that causes a horse to salivate excessively. They don't do that naturally.
So go
It's
back
an
to your
indicator.
inspection. Mm-hmm.
Secondly, if a horse sticks his tongue out the corner of his mouth, why is he doing that? There is a definite reason for that. They're trying to get away from the pressure. Either that or there's a laceration or an abrasion in that tongue tissue. Those things are obvious. They're dead givens. If a horse runs around with his mouth open, there's a definite reason for that. We've pulled on it. Obviously, they don't know how to carry a bridle bit, or we have bruised and abraded that material to the point that it is uncomfortable for them to close their mouth.
Well, how about positive indicators?
Positive indicators, we like to see a white line at the lip juncture between the maxilla and the mandible that indicates that they're salivating. The other part of it, and I understand it's contradictory, when we look at contest horses, we don't like to see a lot of movement in that mouth because it does indicate that there might be something going on.
Discomfort.
However, a relaxed mandible and a certain amount of tongue movement is critical. They can't position a mouthpiece or hold it if they're not relaxed. And back one step more, if we cinch the headstall too tight for them to locate that mouthpiece, all natural balance in a bridle goes out the window.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, between your different disciplines, depending what your goal is, there may be more controlled carriage when you have a horse collected and on the bit versus in your Western disciplines where they may carry it themselves.
Anytime you have an English situation, you are going to have more contact. That doesn't mean they have to be heavy in your hand. It just means that you are going to have a more consistent pressure on that buckle flap than, for example, a Western style horse or a horse that's ridden with a looser rein.